Tonight's presentation will be delivered by John Pheasant. John is a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer with his background with Air New Zealand, but of course he's become a specialist in tiger moths, and the Thruxton is, as I said, a variant of a tiger moth. So in his time with Air New Zealand, he was station manager in Rarotonga, which would have been pretty good posting, I would have thought. But back in New Zealand, moved to Tauranga, and we know him as a next door neighbour to Classic Flyers here. And Gloria and John have been to our presentations on a number of occasions. So welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Evening, everybody. Well, there she is. It proves there's no ground under the wheel, so it actually has flown. In fact, by now I've done about 52 hours in it. So it's, and that's since February 26th of this year. Yeah, most of you have probably read an article about it. There was the May and June issues of Aviation News had a big spruik about it, and Classic Wings about the same time had a story written by Graham Orphan with a little bit of input from me and some photos, and the English Moth Club about the same time also had an article with some fairly good stuff on it. But yeah, for those, so most of you probably know the story about how I got hold of it and so on, but I'll just recap a little. The Jackaroo, as the previous slide suggested, first flew in 1957, and the idea of it was that the English were, the English aviation industry was pretty well bankrupt after the war, and they couldn't get hold of good modern four-seat aeroplanes, so the Wiltshire School of Flying came up with the idea of modifying some of these Tigers that were lying around to make a four-seat. And apparently the managing director who came up with the idea, he discussed it with a bloke named Ron Prizeman, who was a designer with, I believe, with either Doughty Rotol or Fairy Reid in propellers, and they discussed it and sketched out the details of it on a paper napkin over a beer or whatever, and they decided it was feasible, so they got stuck in, and it took about a year to get it through the civil aviation requirements over there, because by this time there was a new set of design requirements in 1956, and we've been involved with that same problem set of design requirements in New Zealand over the years. But some of the things they had to do, they even, according to the articles I read about it, the authorities even wanted them to send it to Farnborough to have the windscreen tested for bird impact by firing dead chickens at it. You know, it's a piece of 1/8" perspex like every other Cessna or Piper or whatever has got. But anyway, they managed to talk their way out of that one. But there were various requirements that they had to get through, but eventually they got the thing flying, and there were 19 of them actually got certificated, but they built 26 kits originally, and 6 of those were destined for India, and for some reason the Indian authorities wouldn't give them an import permit, so the kits were put back into store, and nobody seems to know whatever happened about those. But there were 6 the kit sets for the mod, which would have been the cabin and the modified centre section spars, and there's a steel frame at the front of the fuselage and at the back, which the aeroplane is widened by 12.5 inches, so that you've got a standard tiger moth here, and they moved it out there, and then they put the cabin over it. But to get it back to the front and the middle at the front and the back for the engine and for the rear fuselage, they added a steel frame, which bolted to the widened frames and came back into the middle. So, and this is when you look at it from behind, and when we're over at the hangar, I'll show you. I've got a photo over there, a printout of the fuselage sitting on the frames that I've got, where you can see the steel work before I ever put it all together. But anyway, they got them flying. But by the following year, 1958. They had about 19 flying, but then import restrictions were lifted in England, and modern aeroplanes started to move in, like Piper Tri-Pacers and Cessna 152s and 172s and stuff. And so basically the aeroplane died a natural death. They had 10 of them on fleet at Wiltshire doing ab initio training, and they were using it as a touring aeroplane. And they actually built an agricultural version of it as well. The whole cabin assembly is only bolted onto the structure with 8 bolts. So you could actually unbolt the whole cabin, put a tank in there, and then they put a fairing over the whole thing with a hole in it in the left-hand rear seat. And the pilot, and there's a photo of that, the pilot flew it from the left-hand rear. And it looks the ugliest looking thing you ever saw. But anyway, that apparently didn't go too well either. But so anyway, it basically just died a natural death. And now there are only 2 flying in England. There's 1 in Canada, and now this one. And how I got started in it was my wife and I went to Canada on a holiday back in 1989. And we were pointed, we went to a bloke in Hamilton, Ontario, a bloke named Watt Martin. Now, we had Temple Martin over in Hastings, who was Mr. Moth in New Zealand. Well, Watt Martin was Mr. Moth in Canada, and he was overhauling, he had 3 gypsy moths and 2 tiger moths, and he was restoring and building airplanes and spars and bits and pieces for everybody in Canada. And he had his own airfield, but when we were there, he told us that the local council authorities were going to take his airfield under the Public Works Act and make a rubbish tip out of it. And that apparently is exactly what happened. In Canada, they make a rubbish tip by piling everything, all the rubbish on the ground, and then covering it with dirt and putting a pipe into it, and as it degenerates, it creates methane gas, which they then use to power the local town. It drives the generators. But anyway, poor old Watt lost his airfield, but I believe now his son they have another airfield called Martin Field. Anyway, Watt told me about this bloke not too far away who had a Thruxton Jackaroo. And so my wife and I were able to find it, and the bloke came out and showed us the aeroplane and said, "Oh, I'd love to take you for a fly in it," but he said, "I just had open heart surgery last week." Anyway, but I took a lot of photos of it, and I got interested in it because at the time I had 2 tigers that I was restoring, BFF and ANN, and I thought, well, if I could get hold of one of these things or get hold of a kit, maybe I could build one here. So I wrote to the Wiltshire School of Flying and asked them about these second-hand kits that might be lying around. They responded by saying, "Send us your aeroplane and we'll modify it." So yeah, so that died a natural death too. But anyway, so I sort of just put that aside. But then about 3 years ago, a mate of mine in Australia sent me a link to an auction catalogue which had this Thruxton Jackaroo project as one of the lots. So I thought, maybe at last. So anyway, the upshot was my mate bid on it for me and got it, and a lot of other rubbish too. And then I had to rush over to Oz and get it, and because Bill, my mate, he'd done the bidding at the auction, and then rang me up and said, "Oh, we've got to have everything out of here by Friday, and I'm off to England on Wednesday." So I had to shoot over to Australia, to Brisbane, met up with my mate and his mate, and his mate and I drove from Brisbane to Maryborough, Victoria, 1,600 k's in 20 hours, and as you do over in Australia. And we towed a guider trailer down there, loaded it all up, and all the stuff that Bill had bought as well, and carted it all back to Queensland. And then I spent 3 days living alone in Bill's place and building crates and dismantling things and getting it all over here. And so I spent the next 2.5 years restoring the fuselage. What I got was the fuselage on its wheels with a centre section, a tail which was all skeleton, some of the cowls, no engine, no propeller, no wings. So, but Bill also had a huge stash of stuff. He'd bought a lot of stuff from this, a bloke who'd got it all from the RAAF war surplus. A bit like Ron Dwen, if anybody knows about Dwen Aeromotive up at Ardmore. Ron Dwen bought up all the New Zealand Air Force surplus stuff from the Vampires, the Bristol Freighters and all that sort of stuff. Well, there was a bloke, Harry Wallace, in Melbourne, was the equivalent of Ron Dwen, and he bought all the RAAF spares. And there was a bloke who'd bought up a whole heap of Tiger stuff from a defunct agricultural outfit that had gone out of tiger moths. And anyway, Bill ended up with a whole heap of this stuff. And there was fuselages and boxes of this and boxes of that. And when Bill was in England, after I'd bought this jolly aeroplane, he kept ringing me up from England and say, "Oh, don't forget to go and get some of those and help yourself to that top shelf and do this." So the upshot was I ended up with all of the steelwork for a set of wings, and he gave me a pair of tyres for it, which were perfectly good, but he'd put new ones on his aeroplane and said, "Oh, you can take those tyres." And so, yeah, I was very, very lucky. I saved a lot of money through Bill. And I finally, but anyway, after about 2.5 years, we got the aeroplane flying in February of this year. But I had to, meanwhile, I had to pluck the wings off my other Tiger Moth, BFF. And that's the wings you see there actually belong to the other aeroplane, and that's why they're still silver. The strange looking colour scheme, you notice, if you want to figure out what it was about, you'd only have to Google search a little insect called the Isabella tiger moth, which is a Canadian tiger moth, only about 44 centimetres across, and it's basically orange. And orange being one of my favourite colours, I decided I had to paint it up like an like a Isabella tiger moth. I painted another tiger years ago, AIA, as an English garden tiger moth. So if you Google search that, you'll see why I make these strange, crazy colour schemes. But eventually this one will have its own wings and they will be orange, and various other bits and pieces of colours as well. But so at the moment the aeroplane's flying, and I've done about 51, 52 hours. 2 days after we got the C of A, I suddenly realised that if I was going to take my wife flying, I better go and get current on the jolly thing, because we only had 2 days to before, once we got the C of A, we only had 2 days before the Tiger Moth's annual safari was going down to Ashburton, was coming through Tauranga on its way around East Cape. And so on the Saturday, we got the C of A on the Thursday, no, sorry, we did the test flight Thursday, got the C of A Friday, and Saturday I went and did 4 circuits. And then Tuesday my wife came with me and we went round East Cape. So she was game, but anyway, I left her at Gisborne. She didn't bail on me, but that was as far as she'd planned on going anyway. But then I carried on down to the South Island with the rest of the crew, and I did 25 hours on that trip, and the aeroplane performed as I expected it to. It's a Tiger Moth, a little bit slower than other Tigers, because it weighs 130 pounds more than a standard Tiger. So you're already carrying a second person basically before you get airborne. And initially I've only flown with one passenger because I've only got an RPL, or RPL medical, and I've been waiting for this jolly medical nonsense to sort itself out so that I can carry more. But we did a full load checkout with a mate of mine he's a Tiger Moth pilot, but he's also an ATR captain, and he was on stand down here for half a day. Came over to the hangar and said, "Oh, can I have a look at your plane?" So I said, "Yeah," and he brought his cousin along. And I said, "Well, Pete, if we go out and get you 3 circuits, that'll get you current on the aeroplane." And I said, "Then you can fly the jolly thing, and I'll just sit in the corner and we can take your mate. We can do a full load checkout." He was 107 kilos. His mate was 118 kilos. I'm a mere 80 something. And fortunately, we only had about half a tank of gas. But anyway, we went out, we did that. We did some circuits, and then we loaded up and off we went. And it performs just a little bit slower than a Tiger, as you would expect. But hey, it jumped into the air at about 200 metres. And we went flying for half an hour, and we came back. And I said to him, "Now you've got to land it on 07, past the threshold, but pull up before the main taxiway. That's 204 metres. So he was able to plonk it down in a nice 3-pointer, and we pulled up and turned off before the concrete. So it'll take off in less than 200 metres, and it'll land again. And this is at full weight. We were 34 pounds under max all up. And the Tiger's all-up weight is 1,825 pounds for those old folks, which we mostly are. The Tiger on agricultural overload had an all-up weight of 2,190 pounds. Well, the Jackaroo has an approved all-up weight of 2,180, only 10 pounds less than Tiger Moth max all-up, ag overload. And of course, in the days of Tiger Moth overloads, they used to point them down and no return strip and let them fall into the air. But this seems to perform okay. So it's a bit slow. It's the other Tiger I've got cruises at 80 miles an hour. This one cruises at 75. So that's to be expected because it's got a 12-inch wider profile. But everything else on the aeroplane is standard Tiger Moth. It's got a 130 horse standard engine. The tail's standard Tiger. The wings are standard Tiger because they came off my other Tiger. There's one slight difference if you look at the centre section fuel tank. Those who are familiar with Tiger Moths will think that tank looks a bit fat. And in fact, it's a Queen Bee fuel tank. The Queen Bee, not too many people realise that Tiger Moths were actually the originator of the term drone. During the war, they built 400 wooden fuselage Tiger Moths, pilotless aeroplanes, for use by the Navy as flying targets. And you could fly it from the front seat normally, but the rear cockpit was full of little pneumatic levers and bits and pieces driven by a fan, and they used to launch them off the decks of these ships, and the pilot would stand on the deck of the ship flying the aeroplane around for the gunners to have target practice at. And the one difference really from a Tiger was the fact that they had a 24-gallon tank instead of a 19-gallon tank, and they achieved that by bulging the bottom of the tank. So you can see that the fuel tank there looks almost symmetrical top and bottom. And I was actually given quite a good Queen Bee tank by my mate Bill as well, and I had to get that approved for the aeroplane. Talking about getting approved, when I talked to CAA about what they would do about this aeroplane, because it's a one-off, they said, well, you'll have to put it on limited category because de Havilland Support is a company that runs the Tiger Moth serviceability program, and they relinquished the Jackaroo because there just were only 2 of them in England at the time, and they decided they didn't need to keep that up. So in effect, the Jackaroo doesn't have a continuing airworthiness authority. And so CAA told me it would have to go on special category and then on limited category. But he said at the time, but that's to your advantage because you'll be able to do most anything you want with the aeroplane and we will assess it and issue the C of A accordingly. Well, at the time, I took him at his word and I put a Queen Bee tank in it. And you'll see the little silver thing just behind the cowls. There's a little silver lever there. I'll show. This here. That's my throttle. The fox moth, because it's got a cabin and the cockpit, you have to climb up several stairs. You've got people in the cabin. You've got to start your engine and then get up top. So the pilot actually has a hand throttle for starting. And the gypsy moth, when they put them on floats, they used to have a hand throttle out there so that they could stand on the float, swing the prop, throttle back and climb in. So I decided, well, I'd have to have one of those because I want to carry my grandkids around. And so I built a little hand throttle sticking out the side, and that works really well. And there were a few other little bits and pieces as well that I sneaked into it. Anyway, David Gill, the CAA man, came along and he spent 4 hours going around the aeroplane, and he took lots and lots of photographs of all the different bits of the aeroplane. And toward the finish, he held up his camera and he said, "These photographs will go into the record and become the build standard of this aircraft. If you want to change anything else, you better send me some more photographs." So he was very, very lenient, really. I mean, he was very practical. The aeroplane's, it's a known aeroplane, although it's the only one in the country. It's a known type. They flew very successfully and there are still those 2 flying in England. You've got Golf India Oscar Romeo, the blue one. That one is still flying in England. It's owned by a flying group that does joyrides. And the other one, Alpha November Zulu Tango, that's owned and flown by a woman, Trish Neville. And Trish and her husband Dennis were out here for the Tiger Rally down at Ashburton. And I was very pleased to be able to let both of them fly my plane to see how they felt about it. And they thought it was quite good. But I'll just show you a little feature of ANZT. It's a straight back. It goes straight up to the top. And the side, you can't see it, but the sides, instead of bulging in, the sides are actually streamlined back out. But that was done by a company called Rollison's back in 1960, I think. They actually did the mods on that one themselves. They got the kit from Wiltshire and did the mod themselves. But Ron Prizeman, who was the designer, made the comment afterwards that they'd gone to a lot of trouble and achieved nothing because it hadn't made any difference to the handling or performance or anything else about it. But anyway, so those 2 are the only 2 flying in England, and there's one in Canada. And interestingly, the one in Canada, when it was in England, it was Golf Alpha Papa Hotel Zulu, APHZ. When it went to Canada, it became CF PHZ. And so when I was looking for the rego on mine, I wanted FEZ because the other members of the Tiger Club tend to call me Fez. So, but unfortunately, all the Fs are reserved for hot air balloons, so I couldn't have FEZ. But then I scaled down and I said, oh, there's PHZ. That would be even better. So I emailed the lady registrar and put a nice little case to her, and she was very kind to me. She said, we'll see how the dice are rolling. And when I actually applied, I didn't tick the box requiring a special rego. I just crossed my fingers and sent the form in for a standard rego. And she came back, I've received your application and it seems the dice have rolled your way. So that was very nice. So yeah, on at least 2 of the CAA staff have been particularly good to me on this project. Yeah. But
we shan't talk about the engine guy because that's a whole other story for another night. So.
Yeah, the engine that I got with this aeroplane, it wasn't actually part of the aeroplane project, but it was another lot in the same auction, and I was able to buy that engine for $11,000, and to get a Tiger Moth engine overhauled in New Zealand these days, you're talking 40 to 50 grand. So to get an engine, an overhauled engine with logbook for 11 grand, it owes me 18 here in the hangar with all the GST and freight and all the rest of it. But yeah, so I managed to get an overhauled engine at less than half the value of an overhaul. And which is just as well because my pension fund was starting to run out. But anyway, at the moment I've got the aeroplane flying and enjoying it, and but I've still got to finish the aeroplane because my poor old Tiger Moth sits in the corner with no wings at the moment. So at the moment I'm building a set of new wings for it, and after we've had smoko, that's what we'll go and have a look at, if you like. And we'll be able to look at the aeroplane itself, and have anybody wants to ask questions now or later. Yeah.
John, you've got stripes on above the rego at the back of the...
Mine doesn't have strakes.
Well, what's that thing on the side of the fuselage? Your one.
Oh, no, that's just a shadow, I think.
Yeah. Above PHZ.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just a shadow. Yeah,
Just a shadow.
just a shadow.
That photo was taken by Warwick Hamilton, a local plane spotter and a very keen photographer who was alerted when we were about to do the test flight. And if you look closely, the test pilot is Dave Phillips, who flies the Hawker Hunter and does the magical Tiger Moth aerobatic display. And because he's an approved test pilot, I could have applied to become a test pilot for my aeroplane. I've done 2 test flights on restored Tigers for other people, but nowadays you've got to have a test pilot approval, and that's another $120. So Dave already had the test flight approval, and he leaped at the chance to come down and do the flight for me. So that was him taking off, or just after he was airborne, on the test flight. But there's another couple of very nice photos of it in the air. One taken by Gavin Conroy down at Omaka when we were down there. He did a photo shoot with me. And then John King did a photo shoot out here around the harbour for the one that's on the cover of Aviation News. But so anyway, that's where we stand at the moment. It's all go.
You're wearing a headset. What sort of instrumentation?
He's wearing his own headset. I usually wear a helmet, mainly because I've got a helmet with the earphones built in, and I've got the lead for it. My wife and I both wear our Ivan Campbell classic helmets, but you don't need them. You could fly that aeroplane without anything. It's a little bit noisy inside, but not as bad as the Tiger Moth itself. But I've just yesterday actually completed installing a 4-place intercom system for it, because I only have, at the moment, I've got the radio console out of the Tiger Moth, which has got jack points for 2 for the pilot and the front passenger. But now with a 4-seater, I haven't worried about it until now because I could only carry one passenger anyway. But now that we've done a full load checkout, and I've got 1 or 2 people up on the checkout list for it that are PPLs, so in 2 weeks' time at Tauranga we'll probably be doing a lot of flying with 4 people up. So I've just completed a 4-point intercom system for it, which seems to be working, strangely, because I built it all myself. Ross.
John, one of those 52 hours that you claim in the aircraft was flown with me.
Yeah, 0.8 of an hour. I've logged for you. Yeah.
Memory's better than mine. And you talked about the performance being very similar to a standard VH-82.
Yeah.
I found with my limited Tiger Moth experience, the handling qualities to be exactly like the Tiger Moth.
Well, that's because the wings already knew how to fly. Those wings had done 800 hours on BFF so far, yeah.
I thought you might expand on my comment.
Yeah, well, no, the aeroplane does fly nice and smooth. In fact, probably because the extra 12.5 inches of wingspan, with the wings are now further out, it does seem to be a little more stable in the air than a Tiger. And on approach and landing, it sets itself up very nicely, but it does sink because of the extra weight. It sinks a lot harder than the Tiger. But I haven't been able to do a bad landing yet, so it just floats onto a 3-pointer. Yeah. And everybody who's flown it with me, I've had Pete McComb, Ross McDonald over at Waipak. I got him current on it a couple of weeks ago at the Tail Dragger weekend, and we went and did 3 circuits, and then we loaded up a lady in the back who wanted to come with us out to an airstrip. So I said to Ross, well, let's put our passenger in and do another circuit here so that you're comfortable with the extra weight going in on the airstrip. So we did that, and Ross McDonald managed to get 4 circuits without bumping the aeroplane around at all. And all I did was sit in the back and say, this is what you're going to expect, do it. And of course he's a very experienced Tiger pilot. And then we went over to Bob Gunson's airstrip and landed into wind uphill, and then he took Bob Gunson for a fly in it, and just to see what it was like with only 2 going out of the strip downhill downwind. And then the 3 of us, Ross and I and this lady friend, we took off downhill downwind, and yeah, it was no problem at all. It's just like the Tiger. But the visibility is better than a Tiger because the pilot is now sitting 6 1/4 inches to the left of centre line, so you're not looking directly out over the nose of the aeroplane, and the decking and the cowling is 4 inches lower, so you can actually look from the pilot's position. You can look along the side of the engine, and you get better visibility than the standard Tiger Moth, which is quite pleasant actually.
I should say that
Yep.
the biannual flight review with John Pheasant is more like a checkout or a flight test for the instructor.
Something like that.
Yeah, it was actually.
Yeah.
John, would you like to talk about the modern technology we've got on the aeroplane?
Yeah, did I miss that bit? Yeah.
Missed the solar panels.
I've got solar panels on the cabin roof, and 2 little panels that give the aeroplane 1.1 amps on a good day, and that's enough to keep the radios going on the trip all the way down to Ashburton and back over 10 days, using the radio all the time. Everywhere I parked, I just made sure my back was to the sun, like a cormorant drying his wings. And the batteries have stayed up, and the solar control, the panel controller up in the ceiling has got 2 USB ports. So just for the hell of it, one day I plugged in the iPad and the mobile phone and called a couple of the guys over to just have a look at the aeroplane. Yeah, they were a bit peeved, yeah. Yeah.
John?
But yeah.
On the other Tiger, because it used to do glider towing, you've got a mechanism for that little hook you've got outside your, so you can...
Yep.
Have you thought about doing the same with this?
Oh yes, this aeroplane's equipped with a tow hook, yep.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
Yeah, they used one of these, I believe, in Scotland for many years as a glider tug, and it would be an excellent glider tug because it's a little bit slower than the Tiger for normal, which is perfect for most gliders, and it has a very fine pitch propeller because of the extra weight, the empty weight. The only approved propellers for it at the time was a 6'10" by 3'6" pitch. Now, standard Tiger Moth pitch is 6'4" by 4'11", and we used to use a 4'3" for top dressing and a 4'7" for glider towing. Well, the propeller that I've got on this aeroplane now is one that I had since new in 1974, and it's a 4'7", and it wasn't on the list of approved propellers for the Jackaroo. There's only 3 on the list in the English approval list, and one of them's a metal fan, which there's no way I'd ever put on a Tiger Moth, but one of them another one I've got, but I put this one on. We found on the test flying that it performs just as well as the finer pitch one anyway, and I made sure that this propeller was the one that was on it when David Gill was doing the C of A survey, and I turned it around so that the little stainless steel plate, you can see that shiny thing on the propeller itself, that's the little stainless steel badge on it that gives you the details, the pitch and the drawing and the serial number and all the rest of it. Well, I made sure that was the prop was on when he was taking all these photographs. So that is part of the build standard of the aeroplane and is therefore approved.
We should explain the reason why Fez has the hook on this aeroplane, and I've seen it a number of times. He has his granddaughter beside him, so he's round the front hand propping it, but he's got a hook arrangement out the front of his hangar. So he actually has effectively a little chain, if you will, around the back of the aeroplane so it can't run away with her on board. And he starts it, then pulls the release and taxis off. It's a great system, so that's why he's got...
Yeah, it works really well.
It works really well.
I haven't done it. I've got a tow rating, and I've done towing with the Tiger, and I'll be quite happy to do a tow with this at some stage. But mainly I use the tow hook, as I say, I attach it to a chain on my concrete at the front of the hangar and start the engine, get in, get organised, get all the family sorted out, and do my engine run, and then pull the park brake release like that, and off we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, mate.
John, those leading edge heavy page slats, are they operative?
Nope. What have I done there? No, you can see the... for those that aren't aware, these 3 little covers here, on there, those are the hinge covers for the Handley Page auto slats on a Tiger Moth. They were an optional extra, and they were never fitted to any of the New Zealand ones that de Havilland's built here. And they were always taken off the top dressing aeroplanes because the Handley Page slats are supposed to lower the stalling speed on approach by about 3 to 5 miles an hour. That's what we've heard. But they weigh 15 pounds, which probably puts the stalling speed up by 3 to 5 miles an hour. So those wings are all the internals are there, the hinges are there under the covers, and the cables going down to the locking mechanism. And I've got all the aerofoils at home, but I've never put them on. I was going to get my BFF, the Tiger, sorted and check out exactly how it was flying and everything else, and then I was going to put the slots on and try it all again and just see exactly what difference it made. But I've never got that far. So when I put them on this aeroplane, I again, I haven't put them on. There's no, this aeroplane's got no locking mechanism in the cabin for it. But all the new wings will have all the gear built into them, because one day they might get used on a Tiger Moth or whatever.
John,
Yeah, mate.
the wingspan on the top wing.
Yeah.
How did you get around that with the increased fuselage width for the bottom wing?
They're standard wings, and everything is standard. All they did was there's a steel spar goes through the fuselage under the floor for the front and rear, and then there's another steel spar goes through the centre section at the top, front and rear, that the tank sits on. Well, those spars were simply cut in half and spliced longer by adding an external steel tube, and they're all in no welding. They pinned them together with taper pins, typical 80-year-old British style engineering. There's half a dozen taper pins through each end of each joint. So the spars are 12.5 inches longer, and so you just put your wings on and they're exactly the same. The only different ones are the bracing wires, the diagonal bracing wires. The Jackaroo's wires are longer, and I was fortunate when I got the project that I got a lot of flying wires and stuff with it, and blow me down, amongst them was about 10 of these wires for the centre section, brand new. So the guy whose estate I bought the project from, he'd done a lot of research and he'd done a lot of scrounging and everything else, and he was going to restore the aeroplane, but he was killed in a Tiger Moth accident, and 5 years later his widow put the whole lot up for auction. But
So the top wing is actually 12.5 inches.
yeah, the whole aeroplane is just 12.5 inches wider. The wings, there's nothing different about the wings at all. They're just standard Tiger wings, rigged to the same, and but the fuselage is wider. So in effect, you've got 12.5 inches more wingspan, and your undercarriage is 12.5 inches wider. And that's another interesting point. The Tiger Moth has a maximum crosswind component of 8 knots. Well, the Jackaroo has a maximum rated crosswind component of 16 knots. I haven't tried it yet, but it does handle quite well, and yeah, it's a little bit slower to turn. And the other thing I've found with it, with a fine pitch prop, it's like cruising along in low gear. You've got more pull at slow speed, and so it's a little bit harder to slow down on the grass. You bring your throttle right back, and it just takes that little few more meters to actually stop. So I've got to be a bit more careful around buildings and that sort of thing when I'm taxiing. But that's the only difference I've noticed with the handling, is the speed on the ground. Yeah.
Flying with my cousin in BRM.
Oh yeah.
For another 12.5 inches of increased track.
Yeah.
With a crosswind coming in here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite hairy at times.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Poor old BRM, of course. He's all beat up at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Oh yeah. Had a forced landing down at Omarka 3-4 years ago, and he did he hit a runway marker on landing and broke one leg, and decided to go round again before because he felt this thump, and he went round and got somebody to inspect it, and one leg was badly smashed, so he elected to do a dead stick landing to save his propeller. And so he was over the airfield and burnt off a bit of fuel, and then he came in on turned the engine off at 2,500 feet. Don't ask. and he blew the landing and ended in the riverbed short of the airfield, and ripped the undercar. Didn't damage the prop. But it broke the undercarriage off and broke the bottom wings. Yeah, so it's under.
I remember Dave importing the stainless flying wires from England at that time.
Yeah.
When he did the refit with them.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Fez. Love
That's right. No, it's but anybody who wants is welcome to wander off down to hangar 10 there behind here.
Just over here, over the back here.
Over here somewhere.
We'll get everyone across.
And and have a look at what we're up to with the wings and stuff here.
Definitely worth looking at.
Okay.
So tonight I've chosen to do the vote of thanks, and it goes like this. So we've been privileged tonight to hear the culmination of a story that started, as we heard, 2.5 years ago. And as a branch, we've been privileged to be able to see some of the early stages when we visited. I think Larry and Bruce and others were there on an airfield day. But we didn't actually know some of the story that's come along today. And it's not just Graham Lister talked about the high tech. Well, it's not just high tech for the electrical system. You'll see that the doors are high tech as well when you get there. So look out for the doors, because I don't think that invented the mechanism that existed that John has introduced. So thank you again for a very good speech and for sharing your project with us tonight and previously.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Moving on.
Tighten them up to cram all this middle bay to get it absolutely square, and that 8 stitches to the inch.
Oh,
And then as it dried, it tightened up a little bit.
yeah.
But then you started putting your shrinking dope.
Just shrinking dope on there.
But this, you don't use shrinking dope at all. You iron it, you put it on sloppy, iron it to tighten it.
Amazing.
And if you're not careful, ironing it, you can shrink this by 20%. So on a piece, 100, and I've got a piece there that I marked out 100 mils. I cut it down the middle, and I ironed one side of it. And it shrank 22 centimetres. So if you put it on and iron it too hard, like you get up to I think 300 degrees, it'll shrink 20% and crush the entire structure.
Oh.
A lot of them were glued. People restoring them didn't know or whatever, but that didn't look right, so they glued them on.
So what's the material?
This is this steel piece.
Oh, steel. Okay.
It's called pen steel, actually. It's what they made pen nibs out of
Oh, okay.
in the olden days.
I like spring.
Yeah.
Actually,
This is for those that haven't seen it, this is the synthetic fabric we use these days. This is Seconite, there's various brands. That's a piece I had left over from doing the fuselage. But that fabric, you put it on, what I'll do, I'll make the wings, and then I'll lay the fabric over them and mark it all out. And then I'll get the wife to sew the whole thing into a big bag. And then you just slide that from the tip right to the root end, and then you hand sew it around the end, and it's just floppy as hell. And then you get mum's iron and you set it to 150 degrees. And it tightens it up.
How do I iron your aeroplane?
which was what they used to do in the 1920s when they first made the damn thing. Your mother's iron out and away they went.
No.
It would have been dope. Yes, it would have been. Yeah, it would have been. Yeah.
But if you buy yourself, it's very clever because behind But if you buy yourself, it's very clever because behind
Arrow. Unlike the arrow, the air goes outwards, so it actually retracts outboard. Fuel tanks and the inboard wings. It's gorgeous. Everyone's out here. If you have an audience, someone explain about your tail.
Yeah, this is certified by my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter. That's backwards. If you look at the left hand one, Marty Canton produced them for me from a photograph painting done by my granddaughter. But it's a Jackaroo, commonly referred to as the Roo. And it just happens that I used to be a Roo. I was 50 years ago, I was an Australian. And so they call me, the Aero Club, the Tiger Club members tend to refer to me as the Fez. And so originally I was going to paint a Fez on the back there. But then I've been using the word Roo for so long, I thought, damn it, I'll have a Roo with a Fez on.
Yeah. So that's the Fez on it.
He had to be a fairly elderly Roo, so I've had to learn to put a bit of grey around the muzzle. Because this is big red, you see. The other reason I was going to call it the Roo was the kangaroo, the most well-known kangaroo in Australia is the big red kangaroo. Well, because I was going to paint the nose red, I decided I might call the aeroplane Big Red. The wife wouldn't let me. So I decided, well, anyway, I'll have a kangaroo on the tail. But somebody suggested to me tonight, it wouldn't have been a bad idea. You shouldn't be wearing flying goggles.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm sure Marty could put them on. Marty could easily do it.
Yeah, but the rest of the tail art, you'll understand if you look at this Isabella tiger moth. And I've got one here, it's pale orange, and there'll be these basically little dark orange whips and a few black spots. So the whole airplane in theory will be painted like that.
So you've got some innovative handles here or something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask John to explain the doors, because the doors are something else.
They look like mini doors.
I saw them being put on. It was quite
How many people have had a Morris?
How many have had a Morris Minor?
Oh, minis, your first minis have that.
These are the original latches that came with the airplane. When they did this mod, they apparently had a Percival Proctor fuselage in the hangar, and they decided to make the doors pretty much the same as the Percival Proctor. They needed latches, so they went down to the local Morris Mini Mart and bought the latches. So on the outside, the handles on the outside were boot-led latches from a Mori. But the ones I had were pretty scungy looking, and I was looking around to see what I could do about it, and I just happened to notice that the handles on the workroom door. And they fit perfectly.
So the workroom door no longer has door handles.
So I had to get another set of the workroom door. And another little mod, the gas struts are bonnet struts off a Holden Commodore. The original Jackaroo ones was a steel rod that hung on here and dropped into a little slot here. And they looked so ugly. And I just happened to have some bonnet struts for a Holden Commodore because I used to be in that trade as well. But, yeah.
And then the only other thing...
Solar panels on the cabin roof.
Where does the coffee machine plug into?
You can actually plug into the USB. It's a USB coffee machine. You can plug it in.
The USB port's up there, and they work. I've actually had the airplane sitting on the grass at Kaikoura, and the batteries were right up to speed at like 14.2 volts. So I thought, oh well, I'll charge the phone up. So I plugged the phone in, and I said, "Let's come over with this."
Look at that gas tank compared to Jackaroo's gas tank.
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit bigger.
No, same width.
Same width, it's the same tank.
There's a 6-inch filler box, basically, they're plywood filler box. But no, this was really good on the southern trip in March. Every time I landed there with all the other tigers, everybody would be getting out of their flying suits and untangling their boots and that sort of thing. I'd walk over in my shorts and shirt and say, "What's keeping you guys?"
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Here, look at this. Look at this. Now look back.
First floor.
And it just had so much flexibility, I could nail structure in there. And because I had to do that, I might as well stick it out through the side. And this is so good.
And it's not going anywhere.
Prime, throttle set, contact, switches there, and I do switches if I have to. If I'm away, I also use tops. So I'll normally, again, with the Tiger, I can put here, swing the top. 8 inches too far forward. So I always
His guess he used to be an New Zealand engineer.
I had to replace that latch on a job in New Zealand because one half of the steering wheel broke. There's a spring there caused by side. One leg was broken, so there was a work to renew the clip. I renewed it and that was supposed to be thrown in the bin. One day I might need that. 35 years later.
Well, there's and the first time this engine ever started, hadn't started in.
Well, their design, the switch is designed so that it gets to the right-hand one. You can't start the engine except when you go to start, and it goes only off that one off the impulse. Interestingly, this is the original decal, and the propeller was made by George Adams and Son, which was Invincible Air Screws. But George Adams sold Invincible Air Screws back to the Havilands in the 70s, and it just happened that when I ordered mine, the same guy was building them. The young guys that were down in, he retired, so he sold his business, and the guys that were working at the Havilands were building the spar, the drop, and they put the Haviland label on, and then the Havilands got rid of the business, and the same two guys bought it back, and the younger George Adams and his son was Ken Adams, and he's been working for the Havilands. And so he and two others bought the business back off the Havilands and carried on making it. And it was changed back to Invincible Air Screws. So George Adams and son, the Havilands, and then Invincible by Ken Adams. And this one was made by the same people, but under the Haviland label. It's only probably 4 years worth of propellers that have got that label on. This is 1974. Serial in September 74.
Amazing, eh?
But I made sure this propeller had this badge showing when
You've taken the photo.
took the pickies. Because I hadn't actually told him that it wasn't on the list of approved crops.